Thanks to all the alums here. You know, there's a lot of great things about being at UVA Law. I'm always impressed by the dedication and intelligence of my colleagues. We have wonderful students. But I think what really sets this place apart from other law schools, there's other law schools where there are smart professors and great students, but what really sets UVA apart is the engagement that we have with our alums, the loyalty, the commitment that our alums have for the law school. So it really makes being here special. So I just wanted to start with some thanks for that. So a little bit of background on me. As you heard, I work in the areas of environmental law, and I'm also very interested in the use of tools like text analysis to study the law and legal institutions. And one of the things that I've been doing for some time now is I teach a class that's called Law Tech, that's about how these tools, large language models, machine learning, things we call artificial intelligence, are impacting legal practice and what it means to be a lawyer. So that's the kind of thing that we talk about in that class. And basically that's what I'll be talking about today. Artificial intelligence, large language models, some context on where these things came from and how they're starting to be used and how the profession and law schools and lawyers can adapt. Okay. So we'll start with this. This is the question that people often ask, is AI coming for our jobs? Not just lawyers, but in lots of different domains, but also in law. So just a little word where this image comes from. So I went to ChatGPT. They have OpenAI has a image generating software. It's called DALL-E. And I typed in something like, Chicken Little as a lawyer, worried about the AI sky falling on the profession in a city. And this is what I got, right? And, you know, I'm just like always very impressed by these models. Yes, they have limitations, they have dangers, but I do think it's important for us to not lose our sense of wonder at like what an incredible technological accomplishment these models are, that we're working with today. And so I think that what I try to cultivate is almost a sense of kind of realistic wonder, like recognizing the incredible technology, but also that there are potential dangers. And when I have that attitude, I can understand someone looking at this, like say you're a professional illustrator with a bit of a sense of dread, right? Like in about 5 seconds, I took a very vague idea and I turned it into something like, I don't know, this is pretty cool. It's very highly, it's really articulate, really kind of caught what I was thinking. And so if you're an illustrator, that's very threatening because it was instantaneous, it was free, and it didn't take any technical, I can't even draw like a stick figure practically. And so, you know, maybe we should be worried. Maybe there's something like this is on the horizon for the legal domain as well, where there's going to be tools that can do something like what a lawyer does, except much less expensively and very, very quickly. So, in order to think about that prospect, is AI coming for our jobs, I do think it's helpful to have a little bit of context, a little bit of historical perspective. So one of the things I teach in my law tech class, I try to impart on the students, is there's a very long history of entanglement between information technology and law, right? So once upon a time, chiseling onto stone was the most advanced technology of the day, right? Some of our students might think we were around for that. We actually were not around for that, thank you very much. But nevertheless, that really was an information technology, a profound one, actually. And as information technology has improved and changed over the centuries, that's affected how law is practiced. The printing press affects how law is practiced. West Digest reporters, which is a kind of information technology, affects how law is practiced. Computers, commercial databases, search, the internet, email, Zoom, all these things affect how law is practiced, but it doesn't mean there's no such thing as lawyers anymore, right? It just changes what it means to engage in legal practice, what it means to be a lawyer. That having been said, there is some history of folks thinking about how computers or something computer-like could actually do the job of lawyers. The first instance of this that I know of is actually Leibniz, who several centuries ago was writing. If you didn't know, in addition to inventing calculus and his philosophical contributions, Leibniz was also a trained lawyer. And one of his thoughts was that you could actually have a kind of calculus for law, that you could turn the law into something that could just be computed like mathematics. And obviously that idea sat on the shelf for a long time, But it was resuscitated in something I call the law as code movement in the early to mid 1980s. So the idea with the law as code movement was to translate the law into executable code, to develop a symbolic abstract language to represent legal concepts that you could then turn into like code that a computer would run. And that was the idea. And so this is an example from a mid-1980s paper where what the authors were doing was trying to engage in that project for the British Nationality Act of 1981. And so what you really have is something like this on the far left, like a decision tree, a set of if-then kind of statements. And this is something like you could even remember doing in your law school first-year classes, right, where you kind of take the law and diagram it out. But the idea was to turn that into executable code that a computer would run. And out of that movement, we actually got some interesting things, some interesting products like TurboTax is kind of an example of this. But in the end, the hype was way overblown. This was not going to replace lawyers. And it just, fell afoul of the kind of thing that we teach in our first year classes, like the vehicles and the park stuff, legal indeterminacy, linguistic indeterminacy, the kinds of, the reason why this is not a full representation of the law, basically. And so that was in the mid-'80s. This movement also missed a lot of the life of the law, what it means to be a lawyer in practice, understanding business transactions, making persuasive arguments, telling compelling stories, right? That's also an important part, and that's not represented in a simple decision tree. So the next step in this kind of progression comes about in the late teens, more or less the teens, the 20 teens, and I call it the law as data movement. So the idea with the law as data movement is to use sophisticated tools in natural language processing, machine learning, to represent legal texts as data that can then be subjected to statistical, machine learning kinds of analysis, okay? And so the two components there are these tools, what are called natural language processing tools, so tools that can take as an input regular language that we use and output, statistical models. And so that's one component. And then the other component is the use of machine learning techniques. So machine learning, of course, is where you have very flexible models that are able to take large amounts of data and then make predictions or identify patterns from that data. And so the law as data movement had two components of it. So one is a scholarly component in social sciences and humanities and law that's interested, again, in studying the law and legal institutions. So this is a little chart from one paper that I worked on, was published several years ago, where we're interested in, we use something called the topic model to represent the content of Supreme Court decisions and appellate court decisions. And we're interested in trends in how the Supreme Court becomes more distinctive in the way, in the content of its decisions compared to appellate courts. So I'm happy to answer more about that in Q&A if you're interested, but that's broadly speaking what we did in that paper. And there's a whole group of scholars that are interested in using these tools. But the other component of the kind of law as data movement, the machine learning wave here in law, something I call the predictive turn. There's a predictive turn in various fields. And so within law, things like predicting judicial decisions or predicting administrative decisions using past data, predictive policing or using machine learning or predictive tools to inform enforcement in the context of, say, environmental enforcement or financial regulation. Bail and sentencing, right? So that's another one. Using a machine learning to make predictions about risk in the criminal justice system to inform bail proceedings or to inform sentencing proceedings. So this kind of machine learning can be very, very, very powerful, but it comes with very serious risks and very serious limitations. And so it's important to keep in mind all of those. So for example, in the criminal justice context, we worry a lot that the cost of errors in a machine learning model is not going to be allocated in a fair way across society. And specifically, we're worried about racial discrimination. Nevertheless, machine learning models of this kind are being used very, very broadly in lots of different kinds of government decisions. So it's an important development that to keep an eye on and that is relevant for legal practice. Okay, so that's the law as data movement, and that takes us kind of through the early 20s. The most recent the most recent innovation are these large language models, okay? So each of these kind of build on the other in a way. So large language models show up in the architecture for the maybe contemporary large language models. It's called the transformer architecture. And what that shows up in the late teens. But the really impressive models are kind of a post-COVID phenomenon. Like that's where ChatGPT comes into the world and we start to see these really, really impressive models. And the way that I think of large language models is just, putting aside the technical details, what they are, is they're just very impressive models that perform very, very well on a wide range of natural language processing tasks, so tasks that involve natural language. So what are those kinds of tasks? So these include things like document summarization. There's been a research agenda in document summarization in computer science for like 50 years, and it like solved the problem of document summarization, right? And document summarization 5 years ago was terrible, now it's incredibly good. Document classification, calling a document privileged or non-privileged, for example, a relevant thing in the legal profession. Document classification. Few-shot learning, where you just give a few examples and then the machine can learn to make predictions based on that. General chat, if anybody's used ChatGPT, just back and forth, general chat with ChatGPT. Question answering. Coding, so you can use these tools to engage in, to help with like learning how to code or writing code in languages like Python. Doing translation between languages, so translating between French, Spanish, English, Chinese. These models are extremely good at that. Analyzing documents for style or for sentiment. Argument evaluation, you can give the model an argument, long or short, and it will evaluate it, identify conceptual leaps, identify limits in your argument, identify counter-arguments and potential responses. It can creatively respond to prompts, right? Just like write a little creative short story for you. And probably one of the most impressive and surprising features of these models is that somewhere in there, in this complex neural network that's been created, they somehow encode or embed a huge amount of general knowledge about the world on a very wide variety of subjects. And that's an incredible characteristic about these models. So that's all something that has happened in the last couple of years. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about large language models, of course, is that they're very, very, very powerful, but they can sometimes have what are referred to as alignment problems. So they're very powerful at doing some stuff, but some of the stuff that they do, we don't want them to do. They don't necessarily do what we want them to. And so the things that they do that we don't necessarily want, they include things like just giving unhelpful responses, biased kind of responses, incorrect responses, and then there's the problem of hallucination, right? This thing that we've all heard of, where if you ask ChatGPT a question, sometimes it will just make up a plausible sounding but incorrect response. Okay, so that's your large language models. And when they came out, many people immediately thought of applications in law. It was kind of obvious, given the importance of language to law and how well these tools performed on language tasks, folks just thought law. And OpenAI, actually, one of the first things they did is like a feat of strength of the AI model was they gave it the bar exam and to see how well it performed. There was actually some questions about they kind of tilt the scales on that. But in subsequent models, subsequent follow-up, this is a paper by Dan Katz and co-authors where they kind of do the same thing. And actually, that's the progression. It's kind of interesting. They run through a bunch of older models, and you can see that the models are just getting better and better and better at this task of how it performs on the MBE, the multi-state bar exam. So that's very interesting. And so with large language models, we've now seen kind of two streams that have come out of that. So one stream is the scholarship side, which I have a personal interest in. Like I said, like you heard, the online workshop on the computational analysis of law, like a great name for a workshop, right? Who doesn't want to come to the online workshop on computational analysis of law? But 5 or 6 years ago, all the papers were using topic models or sentiment analysis, and now they're all using large language models, right? So this has really transformed how the scholarship's happening in this area. And they're doing things like using a ChatGPT-like system to identify trends in how justices disagree on the U.S. Supreme Court in the context of their documents. Can we identify different ways over the course of the 200-year history of the court where disagreement, how it happens, why it happens, how it's discussed, and so on. Extracting information from unstructured files that police hold in order to study policing in different parts of the country. Okay, so that's the kind of the scholarship, some of the early scholarship that's being engendered by these models. But in terms of practice, that's where these models really have an enormous amount of potential. So already, this is just the kind of already part of it, We have things like what I call law search. Legal research is what it's called. I call it law search because I'm peculiar. But so law search, going out there and finding the relevant law. So there's already tools, like Westlaw has a tool, Lexis has a tool, where they're integrating large language models into their search products, and these are public, these are on the market, like you can already use them. And the way I think of these as these are first drafts. Very first drafts, they have limitations. They do a good job on some things, not on everything, but they're just going to get refined and improved and refined and improved and refined and improved. There's a tool that I just learned about called Notebook LM. It's a Google product where you can upload like some very large number of documents, I don't know what the limit is, but a large number of documents and make just natural language queries on this. And I can't imagine, or it's very hard for me to imagine that in a few years, this is not going to be the platform that's going to cover a lot of discovery and a lot of document review. It's just very well situated to do that kind of thing. You can do like already queries on the system. You can get like black letter law query, just a basic black letter law. You can get a response back. Most of the time it will be accurate, but you can just double check it. You can review famous cases. You can summarize documents. You can engage in dialogue. This is a very cool thing. You can upload a document and then you can ask it questions. It will respond. You ask further questions and you can go iterate back and forth in order to get a deeper understanding of a case or precedent or a document, a contract, whatever it is you're interested in examining. In terms of writing, which is such a core part of the legal profession, many of our professional lives, you can do things like input bullet points and get back a first draft. It can engage and help you with wordsmithing at the paragraph and the sentence level, identify variants. It can re-summarize. I really like this. You make a document, you upload it, and say, tell me what I just said in this document to see whether it's kind of coming across in the document. Identify weaknesses and counterarguments, I mentioned, just general argumentation checking. You can upload a paragraph, it'll give you back a sentence. If you're writing a brief, some people are bad at writing like the headers. I was never really great at that, and it will give you back like awesome headers. So that alone is worthwhile in the technology. Ditto for contracts, administrative filings, public comments, all of these kind of things these models can be used on. Now, so that's all very interesting, but it doesn't feel like, okay, this is going to really radically transform the profession. It's a useful tool. But what's on the horizon? We're not there yet, but what can we kind of dimly see out there? So here's the thing to picture. So imagine a seamless, hallucination-free search and document drafting tool, okay? The way it works is through an iterative process. You feed in a legal issue, it feeds you back relevant precedent, candidates for relevant precedent, that you can check. You feed that back in your responses. Maybe you add some things to it. You use it as a search tool. It gives you draft information. You make corrections. You feed it back. You iterate. You get more law that's relevant or irrelevant that you can mark as not relevant. And you just iterate on this process until you have your memo or your legal brief or your contract, if it's a contract, your administrative filing, whatever it is. So that's something that feels like different. That feels different than what we currently have. That seems like it would be a different kind of a legal practice in many ways. What about dispute resolution? So say there is a dispute over a contractual provision, say an insurance contract, and you're going to ask whether an insurance contract has an exclusion, whether an exclusion applies or does not apply to some circumstance. Well, you could go to the courts, you can go to an arbitrator, those are expensive processes, but you can already and you can certainly imagine a tool that would be able to provide you with an answer to that question that you could just decide to bind yourself to ahead of time, right? You can just contractually bind yourself to that decision, and it will be a pretty good decision. It's going to be probably at least as good as you would get out of an arbitrator or a court. In terms of kind of accuracy and fitting with like people's common sense understanding or whatever kind of criteria we want to offer. There's a paper in OCAL actually coming up where they the author looks at obviousness in IP and basically finds that a lot of patents are issued for devices or for ideas that actually the language model, it's already in the language model. Like it's kind of non-obvious from the perspective of within the language model, which is very interesting and, and challenges us. Like, does that mean we're granting too many patents? Does that mean now it wasn't obvious before, but now that we have the language model, it is obvious, right? Because we have this tool, right? Does that change the rate of technological development, which would be, very important? We can also imagine integrating this into government, right? So the government official that's drafting a Clean Water Act permit, or the private company that's building, you do environmental law, so that's doing its environmental impact statement. There's all kinds of potential opportunities here where the tool could kind of do a lot of the work for for us. And these are just the beginnings. It's just like what I happen to think are some interesting ideas. There are like hundreds and thousands of people working with billions of dollars to come up with applications and improve these tools, right? And so there's a lot of potentially interesting stuff on the environment. So maybe the question goes back, maybe we should be worried about this stuff, right? Maybe the first impression was that everything's going to be okay, but maybe there is a little bit of a reason to be worried. So this is something called the Moravec paradox. Computer scientists from the 1980s, and I'll just read it. It is comparatively easy to make computers exhibit adult-level performance on intelligence tests or playing checkers, and difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a 1-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility. Okay, so that's interesting. And the point of the Moravec paradox is that human and machine intelligence is just very different from each other, right? It's not like they're doing the same thing better than us. It's just a very different kind of thing. And so what I tell my students in the law tech class is what we always ask the Moravec paradox question, right? Is in any context, what is the thing that the machine can do? And what is the thing that the person can do? And if the machine can do it, expect it to be automated, or better yet, automate it yourself, and I get 10% back because I gave you the idea, and lean into the human component, right? Because that's the thing that's going to remain. So what are the human components? Where do we have our advantages? So these are things like the kid, our little happy child, physical dexterity and perception. But, in retrospect, we were all very enthusiastic about fully autonomous vehicles, but this helps explain why fully autonomous vehicles are actually so hard, right? Because it's a kind of thing that humans have evolved over a very long period of time to be able to do perception and moving around in a physical environment. Social and emotional intelligence, right? You can ask ChatGPT to give you sentiment analysis, but we have a magic thing that ChatGPT does not have, which is we know what it's like to be embarrassed, or we know what it's like to be afraid, we know what it's like to be happy. We have that internal perspective that ChatGPT does not have, and that gives us insights into how other people behave and think and feel. We have practical knowledge. We all just live lives, and we have practical reason that we've accumulated through that experience. Long-term thinking, strategic thinking, judgment. These machines don't do that stuff, right? That's the life of the law, right? That's the life of business. Ethical and moral decision making, right? Again, you can ask ChatGPT for an answer to a moral question. It actually might give you something that sounds kind of reasonable, often does, but it doesn't understand the import, doesn't feel the import of the decision. Okay, flexible learning and open-ended environments. This is really big. So you can train and create a machine that can beat the pants off the world expert at Go and checker and chess, which is pretty amazing. Again, we should marvel at that. But that's got fixed rules that don't change, right? That's a fixed environment. When you go into the open environment world where anything can kind of happen and does, the machine is not set up for that. Machine intelligence right now is just not set up for that kind of thing. Whereas our brains are very much set up for that kind of thing because of the way the world changes. So again, what the recommendation for my students is always to cultivate that human side, lean into the human intelligence, and then just expect everything else to get automated. Okay, so a few final closing thoughts. So what is the role of law schools in all of this? So I think of three things: education, evaluation, and what I call envelope pushing. So education is obviously training lawyers that are going to be able to respond and adapt to this new environment. And not just obviously training them how to use whatever tools on the market right now, but how to have the kind of critical skills, the basic knowledge to be able to identify what's on the horizon, think about strengths and weaknesses, think about opportunities, right, for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, or longer. Life extension technology, who knows, maybe 60, 70, 80 years, right? We will see. But that's education. And also, of course, as teachers, we can start to implement these tools into our curriculum, how we do teaching. So, and I was just thinking a fun idea of, a little law prof bot where you upload a case and you say, do a Socratic dialogue with me over this case to make sure that I understand it, right? And you can kind of do that now, certainly something that could be created. So that's education. Second is evaluation. So that's engaging in normative debates about AI and society as we start making these transformations, especially in areas where law is relevant or policy is relevant. And so this is happening already with my colleagues here, folks thinking about cybersecurity, folks thinking about national security, folks thinking about antitrust, folks thinking about environmental law for that matter, right? There's a lot of different areas, policing, of course, a lot of different areas where AI is going to be relevant, and participating in those debates is an important part of what law schools do. And then the final thing I call envelope pushing. And so the idea here is that law schools can be part of the technological vanguard. Like, we don't have to cede this territory to engineering departments or computer science departments, right? That we can be part of the development of these technologies, be part of interdisciplinary research, identify new scholarly areas or outlets. And one of the things I think is particularly promising is something I think of as kind of engineering in the public interest, right? Is that what lawyers can do is identify places where the private market might not create products that are socially beneficial, where we can work with colleagues to actually figure out interesting technological solutions. So I'll just end with an example of a project like that that I'm working on. It's called AI and Law for Development. And it's a collaboration with primarily just a small group for now, but a computer scientist in South Africa and a researcher in Europe who does AI and law. And the thinking here is, we all know that the rule of law is important for development. In fact, absence of the rule of law or difficulty accessing rule of law institutions in many parts of the world is just known to be a major impediment to development. And so the question is, with these new tools, are there technologies that could be developed that could help address this problem? Not a solve all the world's problems, the rule of law app, right? But instead targeted things that could say, can we improve access to healthcare here? Can we make cross-border, small-scale cross-border transactions easier here? Can we avoid corruption in property transactions over here through some kind of technology? And so the idea with these other scholars is to build a research community that kind of spans over law and development economics and AI and computer science and sustainable development to really identify what those opportunities are, and then build the products, because there might not be money to be made, but there's a lot of good to be done. So, or in areas that are like that. So in any case, for me, I think, it's the sky's not falling, but times are changing, right? It's a very interesting moment to be in this area. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of things to worry about. There's going to be a lot of change, but it's also just a very exciting time to be part of a law school and be part of the legal profession. So again, thank you all for everything that you've done for the law school.